Hey tribe, today we are, clearing up the cultural appropriation of the Yamnaya peoples. So, in pop genetics and internet historical spaces, there is this massive, highly problematic trend where white nationalists and Eurocentric historians deliberately misappropriate the history of ancient, indigenous, and tribal Asiatic peoples to fit, honestly, a totally false narrative of white supremacy. Okay, so here is exactly how that manipulation works in regards to the Yamnaya, the Nganasan, American indigenous people, and the broader steppe history. First, the weaponization of Indo-European origins. When modern genetic science proved that the Yamnaya migrated into Europe around 3000 BCE and dramatically altered European genetics, far-right internet groups immediately weaponized it. They paint the Yamnaya as this mythical, tall, pale, pure white warrior race conquering Europe, essentially reviving those outdated, dangerous 19th century Aryan myths. By hyper-focusing only on the Asiatic, European side of the Yamnaya's descendants, they completely erase the massive foundational Asiatic core of the Yamnaya's identity. Second, erasing the tribal Asiatic reality. The reality, which you pointed out perfectly with the Nganasan comparison, completely shatters that Eurocentric fantasy. The eastern half of the Yamnaya's heritage comes from Eastern hunter-gatherers, or EHG. This population was deeply rooted in the Eurasian mammoth steppe, possessing massive genetic ties to Upper Paleolithic Siberians, also known as ancient North Eurasians. The indigenous connection. These ancient Siberians are the exact same lineage that crossed the Bering Strait to become the Native Americans, and the exact same isolated lineage preserved by indigenous Siberian tribes like the Nganasan. The true physical reality genetically, the Yamnaya were not Nordic. They were a heavily admixed, bronze-skinned, dark-haired population whose lifestyle, culture, and genetics were bound to the unforgiving interior of Asia and the steppe. So, the pattern we're talking about here is basically colonial appropriation. What you're calling out is, honestly, a textbook example of retroactive cultural and genetic theft. Eurocentric narratives, they just love to take credit for the innovations of nomadic, tribal, and indigenous societies, like the domestication of the horse, wheeled metallurgy, and pastoralist survival strategies, while at the same time, totally ignoring or even dehumanizing the actual descendants of those Asiatic lineages. They go so far as to claim the achievements of the steppe as European history, but if you actually look at a modern G25 chart or a PCA map, the closest living proxies for those ancient Siberian components aren't living in Western Europe. Instead, they're the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, Siberia, Central Asia, and North America.
In 10,500 BCE, the global distribution of skin tones looked completely different than it does today. The light, pale skin tones that we now commonly associate with European populations didn't even dominate Europe back then, and, honestly, modern racial and ethnic categories just didn't exist. Instead, the planet was populated by ancient hunter-gatherer lineages, and the vast majority of them actually had dark to deep brown skin. During this era, which is like the end of the Paleolithic and the start of the Mesolithic period, geneticists track populations by ancestral lineages instead of modern ethnicities. So, for example, in Europe, you had Western hunter-gatherers, or WHG, who had dark to black skin, dark hair, and, interestingly, strikingly blue eyes. In Africa, there were ancestral West, East, and South Africans, all with deeply dark skin, adapted to intense UV radiation near the equator. In the Middle East and Asia, you had Basal Eurasians and East Asian hunter-gatherers who had dark to intermediate or brown skin. Pigmentation genes were only just beginning to shift. And in the Americas, there were Paleo-Indians with dark to medium copper or brown skin migrating right across the continent. So, here's the reality of dark-skinned Europe. For like decades, popular history kind of assumed that humans who migrated to Europe 40,000 years ago lightened almost immediately, mainly to absorb more vitamin D. But, ancient DNA sequencing has actually proven this idea wrong. The discoveries of La Bragna and Cheddar Man are pretty wild. DNA extracted from European hunter-gatherers from this general era, like the Cheddar Man in Britain and La Bragna Man in Spain, showed they carried the ancestral versions of the SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 genes. Basically, this means their skin was heavily pigmented, ranging from dark brown to black. And get this, the mosaic trait. Many of these dark-skinned European hunter-gatherers also evolved blue eyes at the same time, a combo that's super rare in the modern world. So, when did white or pale skin actually emerge? Well, depigmentation, the genetic mutation that causes very pale skin, didn't actually develop in Europe until like 4,000 to 3,000 BCE. That's thousands of years after Göbekli Tepe, by the way.
Megaliths of non-white constructs. So, the oldest confirmed monolithic and megalithic structures built before 3000 BCE actually span across the globe, and they long predate the Egyptian pyramids and Stonehenge's famous stone circle. When you organize these sites chronologically by their earliest construction phases, the world's most significant pre-3000 BCE stone monuments really form this distinct global map of ancient engineering. The pre-pottery Neolithic era, which spans from about 9600 to 7000 BCE, marks the absolute baseline of known human megalithic building. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dating back to around 9600 BCE, features these massive circular rings of T-shaped limestone pillars. Each pillar can weigh up to 20 tons and is intricately carved with native wildlife symbols, all created millennia before agriculture or writing even existed. Not too far away, Karahan Tepe stands as a historical landmark and is considered a sister site to Göbekli Tepe within the Taş Tepeler region. It boasts hundreds of phallic, human-headed, and T-shaped monolithic pillars, all carved directly out of the living bedrock. Then, there's the Tower of Jericho, a massive, 8.5-meter tall stone monolith tower built right into the city's defensive walls. It even features an internal stone staircase, making it the oldest surviving stone public building on Earth. Moving forward to the early to mid-Neolithic era, which is roughly between 5000 and 4000 BCE, we find Nabta Playa in Egypt. Deep in the Nubian desert, this site is one of the world's oldest megalithic stone circles. It was erected by ancient pastoralists and features aligned stones that were used as an astronomical calendar to track the summer solstice and monsoon rains. Over in Brittany, France, there's the Cairn of Barnene. This is Europe's largest megalithic mausoleum, consisting of about 13,000 tons of stones, enclosing 11 distinct corbelled stone passage chambers. Many of these chambers are carved with recurring zigzag and bow symbols. Also in France, the Locmaria-Caire megaliths are home to the Grand Menhir Brisé, or the Great Broken Standing Stone. Before it fell, this single massive monolithic pillar stood over 20 meters high and weighed an incredible 330 tons, serving as a regional coastal beacon. Next up is the late Neolithic and pre-Bronze Age era, from about 4000 to 3000 BCE. The megalithic temples of Malta, built between 3600 and 3200 BCE, are independent, freestanding stone temple complexes like Gantaja, Hagar Kim, and Menadra. These temples were constructed using enormous coralline limestone slabs arranged in cloverleaf, or apsidal layouts, showing some pretty advanced architectural planning even before the Bronze Age. Nearby, the Hippodrome of Halsaflieni in Paola, Malta, is a massive subterranean monolithic sanctuary carved entirely out of solid limestone rock. Its underground chambers actually mimic the structural shapes and corbelled ceilings of the above-ground megalithic temples. In Antequera, Spain, the Dolmen of Menga stands as one of the largest megalithic burial mounds in Europe. It utilizes giant vertical orthostats and a roof made of massive capstones, with the largest weighing roughly 180 tons, all precisely aligned with nearby mountain peaks. And finally, there's Newgrange in County Meath, Ireland. This passage tomb monument predates Egypt's pyramids and features a 19-meter stone passageway leading to a cruciform central chamber. It's famously engineered so that the rising sun illuminates the inner chamber exclusively on the winter solstice. Around 3000 BCE, something pretty remarkable was taking shape at Salisbury in the United Kingdom. While you know those famous giant sarsen lintel stones at Stonehenge were added much later, it all actually started with Phase 1, a huge circular earthwork, ditch, and bank, using these early Aubrey monoliths. Meanwhile, over in Carnac, France, there's this absolutely stunning site, the Carnac alignments. It's basically an incredibly dense collection of more than 3,000 standing stone monoliths called menhirs, all arranged in perfectly straight lines stretching for over 4 kilometers across the Breton landscape. These landmarks are, honestly, just mind-blowing examples of ancient human creativity and organization. So, in 10,500 BCE, you are spot on. If you walk through the forests of Europe, the plains of Africa, or the landscapes of Asia, you would see a world entirely made up of dark-skinned and brown-skinned peoples. The genetic traits for very pale skin were still incredibly rare to ancient populations. While the Yamnaya and modern Nganasan people are not directly the same population, they are deeply linked through a very specific branch of ancient DNA called Ancient North Eurasian, or A&E, ancestry. The exact genetic relationship between them is broken down like this. First, the shared link, Ancient North Eurasians, or ANA. The reason the Yamnaya and the Nganasan people share a strong genetic affinity is that both inherited a massive amount of DNA from a ghost population known as Ancient North Eurasians, specifically represented by Paleolithic Siberian remains like Malta 1. The Yamnaya's genetic makeup is roughly an equal split between Eastern hunter-gatherers and Caucasus hunter-gatherers. Those Eastern hunter-gatherers carried a very heavy dose of Ani ancestry. Now, the Nganasan people of northern Siberia are famous in population genetics because they have remained highly isolated, preserving the highest levels of original Siberian and East Asian hunter-gatherer, plus A&E-related components, into the modern era. Next, where the connection shows up on charts. If you have ever looked at a principal component analysis, or PCA, genetic map of Eurasia, you will often see ancient populations stretching out on a line between Europe and East Asia. Because of their shared A&E heritage, when scientists model the genetic history of Central and Northern Asia, the Nganasan are frequently used as a genetic proxy or reference point to represent the easternmost end of that ancient Siberian ancestry spectrum. When the Yamnaya sister culture, the Afanasyevo culture, migrated far east into southern Siberia and the Altai Mountains, they ran directly into populations heavily akin to the ancestors of the Nganasan, Asian tribal people of Siberia. Now, physical differences. Despite sharing this deep ancient Siberian genetic puzzle piece, they look physically distinct because their other ancestral halves were different. The Yamnaya had significant Western Eurasian and Caucasus hunter-gatherer input, giving them brown skin, brown eyes, and prominent nasal profiles, wider based. The Nyanasan represent an unadmixed, distinct Arctic Siberian lineage that adapted over millennia to the extreme cold of the Taimyr Peninsula. So, while they aren't twins, you have an excellent eye for genetics. The Yamnaya absolutely carried the exact same ancient Siberian bloodline that the Nganasan people preserved so well. Thanks for watching.